welcome to Conservation and Biodiversity Week. Woohoo! All right, we're going to start with a video.
Our planet's diverse, thriving ecosystems may seem like permanent fixtures, but they're actually vulnerable to collapse. Jungles can become deserts, and reefs can become lifeless rocks, even without cataclysmic events like volcanoes and asteroids. What makes one ecosystem strong and another weak in the face of change? The answer, to a large extent, is biodiversity. Biodiversity is built out of three intertwined features: ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. The more intertwining there is between these features, the denser and more resilient the weave becomes. Take the Amazon rainforest, one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth due to its complex ecosystems, huge mix of species, and the genetic variety within those species. Here are tangled liana vines, which crawl up from the forest floor to the canopy, intertwining with treetops and growing thick wooded stems that support these towering trees. Helped along by the vines, trees provide the seeds, fruits, and leaves to herbivores such as the tapir and the agouti, which disperse their seeds throughout the forest so they can grow. Leftovers are consumed by the millions of insects that decompose and recycle nutrients to create rich soil. The rainforest is a huge system filled with many smaller systems like this, each packed with interconnected species. Every link provides stability to the next, strengthening biodiversity's weave. That weave is further reinforced by the genetic diversity within individual species, which allows them to cope with changes. Species that lack genetic diversity due to isolation or low population numbers are much more vulnerable to fluctuations caused by climate change, disease, or habitat fragmentation. Whenever a species disappears because of its weakened gene pool, a knot is untied and parts of the net disintegrate. So, what if we were to remove one species from the rainforest? Would the system fall apart? Probably not. The volume of species, their genetic diversity, and the complexity of the ecosystems form such rich biodiversity in this forest that one species gap in the weave won't cause it to unravel. The forest can stay resilient and recover from change. But that's not true in every case. In some environments, taking away just one important component can undermine the entire system. Take coral reefs, for instance. Many organisms in a reef are dependent on the coral. It provides key microhabitats, shelter, and breeding grounds for thousands of species of fish, crustaceans, and mollusks. Corals also form interdependent relationships with fungi and bacteria. The coral itself is a loom that allows the tangled net of biodiversity to be woven. That makes coral a keystone organism, one that many others depend on for their survival. So what happens when destructive fishing practices, pollution, and ocean acidification weaken coral or even kill it altogether? Exactly what you might think. The loss of this keystone species leaves its dependents at a loss too, threatening the entire fabric of the reef. Ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity together form the complex tangled weave of biodiversity that is vital for the survival of organisms on Earth. We humans are woven into this biodiversity too. When just a few strands are lost, our own well-being is threatened. Cut too many links, and we risk unraveling it all. What the future brings is unpredictable, but biodiversity can give us an insurance policy, Earth's own safety net, to safeguard our survival.
All right, so I thought we'd start with an introduction. So in order to understand biodiversity, we have to go back to the beginning of life on our planet, which happened during the Cambrian period. That's big explosion of life, lots of fishes and all that crazy stuff started happening. But this is all during what we call the Paleozoic period. So life made a lot of transition during this period from sea to land, and terrestrial plants evolved first. And among these, the ancestors of ferns and mosses were prominent in our primeval landscape. They were followed by cone-bearing plants, the ancestors of modern conifers, such as pine trees and junipers. And about 170 million years ago, flowering plants appeared, flourished, and spread all over the earth, becoming the dominant organism of the landscape. Along with the emergence of new plants, new animals, insects, microorganisms also evolved. And during this time, Earth has witnessed the evolution of millions of new organisms. However, we have also witnessed a similar number of natural extinctions of species. At any point in time, the net balance between the emergence of new species and the extinction of existing species constitutes what we call Earth's biodiversity. So biodiversity has become one of the major environmental problems of our time. The underlying problem is increasing extinction rates as a result of population growth, resource depletion, land clearing, and land use evolution, especially in the tropical forest environments. Remaining tropical forests cover about 10% of the Earth's land surface, but contain about 50% of all of the species on their planet. And current global extinction rates are estimated to be 1,000 times faster than what would be the natural rate, within the majority of species extinctions occurring in the tropical forests. This week, we're going to examine how and why global diversity is declining, why rising extinction rates are a serious concern for humanity, and how conservation is working to slow its decline. So, biodiversity, again, is defined as the number of species inhabiting a particular geographical area. And a species is defined as the base unit of biological organization in nature. And it's defined as an organism or a group of organisms in which genes flow freely between individuals in their natural environment. However, not all species require crossbreeding to pass genes to the other individuals. For example, plants are capable of asexual reproduction. One such means is what they call vegetative regeneration or cloning, in which a new plant is formed from the living tissue or fragments of another plant. Nevertheless, the most common means by which members of species share genes is through crossbreeding. Conversely, the inability of members of different species to mate is the most common means of separating species and making them distinguishable from each other. So if you have two different things and they get together and they don't create reproductive offspring, so for example, a horse and a mule make a donkey, but that donkey can't reproduce. You can't put a donkey in a donkey. The only way to get a donkey or a mule, one of those. Anyways, each species represents a unique gene pool. The genetic resource of all life is what we call the gene pool. And the total number of genes contained in the chromosome of species varies. So some species have 64, some have 187, some have 12. As such, it targets most organization and tens of thousands of people. Genes contain the genetic information of all organisms, and this vast information compendium is unique to each species. So when a species disappears from the earth, its genes are lost forever, and there's no way to get it back. So once it's gone, that's that. So the process that results in the formation of new species is termed speciation. And it takes place in nature at radically different rates depending on the organisms involved and the conditions of the environment. Broadly speaking, it appears the frequency of speciation among plants, animals, and insects typically ranges from hundreds of thousands to several million years. Extinction, of course, represents the opposing process of speciation. In general, the natural lifespan of a species ranges from 0.5 to 1 million years, so 500,000 to 1 million years. Biologists define two basic mechanisms of speciation: geographic isolation and polyploidism. So let's talk about geographic isolation. Geographic isolation involves the splitting apart of a population by a physical barrier of some kind. This barrier can be created, among other things, by the formation of mountains, or the formation of a deep valley like the Grand Canyon, or a new water body that comes into being. In any case, some members of the species are restricted geographically from interbreeding with the main population. And as a species population, these isolated individuals evolve independently and frequently create a new species. And crossbreeding or hybridizing with the original population is limited by the barrier, but the two populations tend to diverge along separate lines. So if you're familiar with Darwin and his finches, they believe, I mean, they're all finches, but they each have different types of beaks based on what kind of foods they eat and which island they ended up being on. And we'll talk more about Darwin and his finches in a little bit. Another type of speciation is called polyploidy. Polyploid, so diploid organisms like us, we have two complete sets of chromosomes. And polyploidy often refers to like what they call whole genome doubling, or WGD. It's defined as the presence of 3 or more complete chromosome sets in an organism. And this has got a really long history, dating like way back to the 1900s, when researchers first observed the formation of a higher chromosome number via the addition of extra whole chromosome sets present. So polyploidy typically results in instant speciation. The new polyploid is immediately isolated reproductively from its parent or parents, and this greatly increases biodiversity and provides new genetic material for evolution. So, for example, if you look at strawberries, like wild strawberries are very, very small, but the ones you like get chocolate dipped and stuff like that, or you find in the grocery store nowadays, are like really, really big. So ultimately, it involves the formation of a mutation within the gene pool, and that mutation is maintained by interbreeding with individuals, such as the parents possessing the same gene traits. It's the same way we get seedless watermelons. Of the two means, this is the least common, and it appears limited mainly to plants. So you'll notice all of the examples are plants because most of the time it's dealing with plants. So the geographic area occupied by a species is called its range, and the range of species varies enormously in size, shape, and location. Over the life of a species, its range may change substantially as a result of various changes in the environment, such as like the removal of a barrier to migration. So, for example, it is theorized that a lot of the large land mammals that made it to North America came across the Bering Sea. So from like the Eurasian continent to North America during a cold period where there was like a land bridge. And so many agricultural plants, such as like wheat and rice and corn and tons of weeds, have undergone dramatic increase in range over the past 10,000 years with the spread of farming and transoceanic travel in our time. However, unfortunately, the opposite trend is more common. The ranges of thousands of wild species have been like reduced or fragmented or completely eradicated. For example, the buffalo is a good example. Several types of ranges are common to terrestrial species. The largest are called intercontinental ranges, which span 2 or more continents. So this map here is showing all of the rats. So you won't find rats in the blue areas, but everywhere else you'll find rats. So these include also known as cosmopolitan or worldwide distributions. The species range is continuous over all land masses wherever its habitat type is found. Many of the weeds and vermin that have followed humans and agriculture are cosmopolitan species, like cockroaches, or like this map here that shows rats. Houseflies, another good example. Among plants, many species of plants, for example, are intercontinental, for example, the palm tree, but their range are limited mainly to the tropics within that like tropical range. Another example is beech trees. They're called the southern beech, which can only be found in the southern hemisphere because they are a remnant of a land called Gondwana, which was the landmass before Pangea about 65 million years ago. And so when these, continents were closer together, the beech tree, they were closer together, and then they've kind of spread apart, but can only be found in the southern hemisphere. At the other end of the spectrum from intercontinental species are endemic species. These are small range species, usually confined to and distributed in a single geographic area or habitat. And they're small local patches of a single geographic area. So endemic species are distributed all over the world, but especially in the tropics. Examples of endemic animals are like the panda bear or the American alligator or polar bears. That's another good one. Plants, let's see, the sequoia is an endemic plant. The Joshua tree is an endemic plant. Vicariids, or what we call vicarians. So in the tropics, many endemic species are actually micro-endemic species. These are species with very small ranges, for example, in the canopies of several trees, or an island in a lake, maybe in a river channel. So these are known as vicariids. These are genetically very similar because they evolved from a common population, yet they have become different species because of separation owing to barriers of some sort. Again, a barrier is just a geographic obstacle, like a large river, or merely just like a certain distance that limits breeding between the various populations of origin. So here's a map of bothropes, I think is what they're called. It's a genus of highly venomous pit viper snakes endemic to the neotropics. Formerly, they were highly deadly, but nowadays, their snake bites fairly treatable as long as you get the antidote in time. But you can say each of these diverged from a common ancestor. So they're very similar, but they have adapted over time to their genetic range. So another map is the separation of marine creatures on either side of Central America when the Isthmus of Panama closed about 3 million years ago, creating a land bridge between North and South America. Populations of snapping shrimp, seen here. A biologist and her colleagues found that the shrimp on one side of the isthmus appeared almost identical to those on the other side of the isthmus, and which makes sense because they used to be members of the same population. But when she put the males and the females from different sides of the isthmus together, they snapped at each other rather than trying to court each other. So they've determined they've become separate species, just as the theory of vicariance would predict. Almost all species that have ever lived on Earth have become extinct, but it seems that more species inhabit Earth today than at any other time in Earth's history. However, long an organism has existed on Earth is a matter of definition, and it depends on whether we measure extinction by the loss of a species or by the loss of its genes. So, for example, and this is an image that shows you different reasons why extinction occurs, but if we measure it by the loss of a particular species, let's see, the dinosaur is a particular species, but if we talk about the loss of its genes, there are critters on the planet that have genetic links to the dinosaurs. So are they really extinct, or have they just evolved into new and interesting different species today? Is kind of what that's about. So biologists make a distinction between chronospecies extinction, or what we call pseudo-extinction, and true extinction. All species evolve from other species. Most speciation is characterized by a gradual shift in the population into a new form, closely resembling its parents. For example, Homo sapiens sapiens, us. and the genetic makeup of the parents and the offspring species are nearly identical. Therefore, extinction of the parent species usually does not represent loss of the entire genetic package. In other words, as one species evolves into another, the disappearance of the older species is defined as a pseudo-extinction because the original genes endure. The more meaningful measure of extinction is based on the life of a clade, which is defined as a species and all of its descendants. So a clade includes all of the species in a genetic line from a time the first ancestral species split off to the moment the last species dies off. And the life of clades appears to range from 1 to 10 million years for plants. Extinction caused by humans is clearly different from pseudo-extinction because it does not allow for maintenance of genetic lineage through evolution or offspring species. Moreover, human-driven extinction may result in the elimination of clades as well, especially for closely related endemic species, such as vicariids, which together occupy, again, small geographic areas by land. And if we like clear an area, or we like flood a reservoir, or we develop the land, we could very well create this total extinction of a species. So genetic diversity is the total number of genetic traits in a genome of a species, and it can range from the number of species to interspecies differences and can be attributed to species survival. So this is distinguished from genetic variability, which describes the tendency of traits to change. So diversity serves as a way for populations to adapt to changing environments. The more variation, the more likely that some individuals in the population have variation that's suitable for their environment. These individuals are more likely to survive or to produce offspring with those alleles. A good example of this is like wine grapes in California. So for a while, like way back when we first started creating wine in California, what they did is they brought over these old growth grapes from like France and Italy and places like that. And they brought those over. And they were doing okay for a while. And then there was I think it was either a bug, like like an insect, or it was like a fungus, bacteria type thing. But the plants started dying, and they were like, oh no, like we want to create these wine grapes. But some of the species survived, and so those have stuck around, and because of their variation in their population, they were able to adapt to this changing environment, and so those have continued generation after generation. This is a great article about the plight of pumas, and if you're interested, so one of the like P22, the mountain lion, which is a type of puma, we're trying to figure out how to get the diversity back into this small, like isolated group, and they're isolated by the 101 freeway. And so they've started like creating bridges over or under the 101 freeway so that the pumas on one side of the freeway and the pumas on the other side of the 101 freeway can like intermix and bulk up their genetic diversity, because that's how it happens. If you get a lot of inbreeding, then a lot of times you get, pass on genes that are not necessarily the best. So I guess is the best way to think about it. You do not have to venture far into popular media to run across the statement like this. What's so serious about the loss of a few thousand species each year? The Earth's got like millions of them, and most of them have no benefit to us humans. In fact, some of them will kill us. Statements like this are like really naive for several reasons. So putting aside the moral issues of whether or not one species is more like we have the right as humans to exterminate, other species, there are purely practical considerations, such as the loss of undiscovered food or medicinal sources, things like that. So humans currently utilize very few plants for food. Only 20 species provide 90% of the world's food. And only 3 plants, wheat, rice, and corn, provide most of our food supply. There are literally thousands, perhaps more than 30,000 plants, many of which have nutritional and caloric values that match or exceed many common food crops, making them very promising agricultural food crops. Many of these plants are known to indigenous cultures, especially tropical fruits and root vegetables and grains, such as amaranth, which is a favorite of Central American Indians. However, thousands of edible plants remain undiscovered or poorly understood regarding their ecology and potential for domestication and food production. Many of these plants may disappear long before we even figure out their value to humanity. 40% of all of the drugs that you find behind a pharmacist counter in the Western world are derived from plants that people have used for centuries, including the 20 best selling prescription drugs in the United States today. For example, quinine, which is extracted from the bark of a South American tree, relieves malaria. And licorice root has been an ingredient in cough syrup for almost 4,000 years. The species native to the United States has a broad range from the western parts of Ontario, Canada, to Washington, and all the way down to Texas and Mexico and everywhere in between. There are leaves and roots that have been used for treating sores and toothaches and fevers in children and sore throats and cough and tons of stuff, but reducing weight and making you not want to eat as much food and all that good stuff. So genetic diversity is super important. All domesticated organisms originated from a wild species. Rice, corn, goats, cows, chickens. At one point, all of that, your dogs used to be wild. We domesticated them. Each of these species have exhibited tremendous amounts of genetic diversity within its own race. So not all dogs are alike, but I just learned about a new dog today. I was like, what? They're like, yeah, it's like the French, fricassee or whatever they're called, but they were, imported into Cuba. So now they're like Cubanese dogs or something like that. And I was like, what the heck? There's so many different types of dogs out there. But they all trace back to, dog ancestors from long ago. So it's important to remember that genetic diversity is super important to survival of a species, because if you have a variety of genes, then you're going to have an opportunity for certain portions of the population to not be deeply as impacted as other parts. The whole survival of the fittest idea. So, some genetic diversity, some strains of plants and animals will be more resistant to certain stresses in the environment, like disease or drought. And then with domestication, the natural diversities within that species is reduced as, we refine and we start genetically modifying organisms to make the fruit bigger or make the wheat grow, 2 pieces of wheat for every stalk or whatever, or, the fact that our ears of corn are 9 or 10 inches long and thick and juicy. I mean, if you went back and saw pictures of, the original corn, what all corn came from kind of thing in North America, it did not look like our corn today. And then, of course, if you're a farmer, you're going to pick the crop that has where the seeds from the plant that, you know, did the best last year. And then, you know, you're gonna again keep refining it down until you get the, you know, the best yield from your corn product, right? So for example, Roundup, so Monsanto created a Roundup ready corn, wheat, all those things. So what does that mean? That means you can spread their corn. Corn's a great example. Genetic diversity can be restored in many organisms by, you know, breeding them back with their ancestral wild stock. But what if the wild stock no longer exists? What if, you know, we've domesticated things so much like wheat and corn that we've destroyed a lot of the original population and the original habitat of that population? And so, you know, how can we, you know, remix the mix if there is no wild stuff out there? I guess if we wanted to go back, we could, you know, take the dogs and breed them back with wolves, which I actually had a friend once who had a wolf dog hybrid. It's important to note that geneticists, biologists are trying to preserve the wild stock, and efforts are being made to search out and protect these organisms against extinction. So some of them are no longer exist, but for many others, there are large and diverse gene pools. But it's important to note that, like, there are also like smaller, I mean, if you think about how large the gene pool used to be, like even if we've preserved, you know, a few species, for example, the panda bear, you know, we just keep like moving the pandas around, but they're all like from the same family, you know. So it's really hard to recreate the original diversity. For example, the North American bison or wild rice, they both have been saved from extinction, but much of their genetic diversity has been lost because of the small population. Once we realized, hey, we really need to do something about this bison population, by then there'd been a lot of interbreeding. All right, so no discussion of biodiversity is complete without a discussion of the theory of evolution, which is in its shortened form, the theory of evolution by natural selection, which was proposed by Charles Darwin and a guy named Alfred Russel Wallace in the 19th century. Remember, a theory is an idea of how something works in nature that has undergone rigorous testing through observation and experimentation to prove whether the idea is right or wrong. Regarding the evolution of life, various philosophers and scientists, including 18th English physician named Erasmus Darwin, proposed various aspects of what would later become the theory of evolution. But evolution did not gain the status of a scientific theory until Darwin, the English physician Darwin, Erasmus, his grandson, Charles, published his famous book, The Origin of Species. Darwin and his contemporary science, Alfred Russel Wallace, proposed that evolution occurred through a phenomenon called natural selection. The theory of natural selection states that an organism produces more offspring than it can survive in the environment, and those that are physically equipped to survive will grow and multiply, and individuals lacking the fitness either do not live to a reproductive age or produce fewer offspring than their peers. So natural selection is something called survival of the fittest. This is because the fittest organisms are those most suited to their environment and are more likely to breed more successfully and pass on their traits to the next generation. This means that as the environment changes, the traits that enhance survival in the environment also change or evolve. And so natural selection is a very powerful idea to explain the evolution of life. It established, again, as a scientific theory, and since then, biologists have observed numerous examples of how natural selection influences evolution. It is now known to be just one of several mechanisms by which life evolves. For example, a phenomenon known as gene drift can also cause species evolution. In genetic drift, some organisms produce more offspring than expected, purely by chance. And these organisms are not necessarily the strongest of their species, but it is their genes that are passed on to the next generation. Evolution, the other guy. So there was another guy, and his name was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck is now associated with a discredited view of evolution. He was a French biologist whose notion of organisms was that they inherit the traits acquired during their parents' lifetime. And it has kind of common sense. It was called like the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And there were many people who supported this idea well into the 20th century. So this Lamarck guy was around in the middle 17 to early 1800s. He's one of the best known early evolutionists. Unlike Darwin, he believed that living things evolved in a continuous upward direction from dead matter through simple or more complex forms towards perfection. Species didn't die out in extinctions, he claimed. Instead, they changed into other species. And since simple organisms exist alongside complex organisms today, he thought they must be continually created by what is called spontaneous generation. According to him, organisms altered their behavior in response to environmental change. Their changed behavior in turn modified their organs, and then their offspring inherited those improved structures. For example, giraffes developed their elongated necks and front legs by generations of browsing on high tree leaves. The exercise of stretching up to the leaves altered their neck and their legs, and their offspring inherited these acquired characteristics. According to Darwin's theory, giraffes that happened to have slightly longer necks and limbs had a better chance of securing food, and thus they were able to have more offspring. They were the select who survived. Conversely, in Lamarck's view, a structure or organ would shrink or disappear if used less or not at all. Driven by these inheritable modifications, all organisms would become adapted to their environments, even as the environments changed. Unlike Darwin, Lamarck held that evolution was a constant process of striving towards a greater complexity and perfection. And even though this belief eventually gave way to Darwin's theory of natural selection, which was acting on random variation, Lamarck is credited with helping put evolution on the map and with acknowledging that the environment plays a role in shaping the species that live in it. All right, according to a National Geographic article from September of 2019, the rate of extinction is far from constant. At least a handful of times in the last 500 million years, 75 to 90% of all species on Earth have disappeared in a blink of an eye due to a catastrophe or what we would call a mass extinction. And although mass extinctions are deadly events, they really kind of open up the planet for new life to emerge. It's like having a forest fire. It opens the canopy so that new things can come out. The most studied mass extinction was the one with the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene period. It's about 66 million years ago. It killed off all of the non-avian dinosaurs and made room for the mammals and the birds. And it allowed us to really rapidly diversify and evolve. So that's the big one that, the most recent one, but it's also 75% of all the animals on the planet gone. So Earth, though, is currently experiencing a biodiversity crisis. Recent estimates suggest that extinction threatens up to 1 million species of plants and animals. A lot of that has to do with human activities, such as hunting or overfishing or deforestation. Other serious threats include the spread of invasive species and diseases from humans, as well as pollution and climate change, obviously. Today, extinctions are occurring hundreds of times faster than they would occur naturally. If all species currently designated as critically endangered or vulnerable go extinct in the next century, and if that rate of extinction continues without slowing down, we could approach the level of max extinction in like 250 years, 500 years or so. Climate change presents a long-term threat. Humans burning of fossil fuels has led us chemically imitate large igneous provinces through the injections of billions of tons of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere each year. By total volume, the past volcanoes emitted far more than humans do today. For example, in Siberia, they released like 1,400 times more CO2 than humans did from burning fossil fuels. However, we are emitting greenhouse gases as fast as, or even faster than, it did in Siberia, and our climate is changing as a result. So as mass extinctions show us, sudden climate change can be profoundly disruptive. And while we haven't crossed the 75% threshold of mass extinction, it doesn't mean that things are fine. Well, before hitting that grim marker, the damage could throw the ecosystem we call home into chaos, jeopardizing species all around the world, including ourselves. For example, there are no bees left in China, and bees pollinate food, among other things. I mean, yeah, they pollinate flowers, but they also, without bees, there are no almonds. So I think Albert Einstein or someone like that once said that once the bees go, humans will be gone in 4 years. So, all right, geographic diversity. So much of our understanding of the relationship between biodiversity and the environment is derived from something called island biogeography. It shows that it pays attention to two geographic factors, area and distance. And those two things strongly influence the diversity of species. So if we go further, if we get beyond the area and distance, the three processes that really impact, instead of just biodiversity, but island biogeography, it's immigration, evolution, and extinction. So, and these are determined by the area and the isolation of the islands from other areas, and how big, the not only the distances, but how much resource availability there is within the island. So it's also known as insular biogeography. It provides some of the best evidence in support of natural selection and the theory of evolution. The term describes an ecosystem that is isolated by being surrounded by different ecosystems. So for the purpose of this theory, an island is defined more than just a piece of land surrounded by water. It includes the mountain peaks, a lake surrounded by a desert, patch of woodlands, even a national park. The theory provides a model to explain the richness and uniqueness of species, both plants and animals. The two events that determine how many species are found in an ecosystem are basically immigration. That means, the movement of them, and then extinction, how many have died off. So research has shown that how big an island is and how far it is from the mainland have a great influence on the number, which we call species richness, that are found there. So if you look at this chart, you're looking, if it's a very large place, but it's close by, then This is going to be what happens to the number of species. So once species have established themselves on an island, the rate at which they go extinct depends on the size of the island. So the likelihood of extinction is smaller on large islands. And this is called the species area relationship. Yeah, species areas relationship. It's not just observable, it can also be like predicted mathematically. So by the same theory, the farther an island is from the mainland, the fewer species it tends to have. And this is called the species distance relationship. So this image above shows how the size of an island and its distance from the mainland interact with immigration. So colonization is the orange lines, extinction events are the green lines, and the extinction events influence the richness of the species. Some good examples of island biogeography are Australia and Cape Verde. So let's just start with Australia. So marsupials like kangaroos and wallabies live only in Australia. And if marsupials existed anywhere else in the world, it would mean that they did not arise through natural selection or evolutionary processes. The fact is that 75% of mammal species are endemic to this continent. However, there are some exceptions due to continental drift when animals were able to move around large land masses before they were separated. During a visit to the Galapagos and Cape Verde Islands in the 1830s, Charles Darwin encountered species found nowhere else on Earth, including the giant tortoise, which is still only found down there, the Galapagos tortoise, blue-footed boobies, and of course the famous Darwin finches. But it's not just the fact that these isolated environments gave rise to unique species. Each island had its own species. Furthermore, Darwin pointed out at the time, the species on the islands were not found anywhere else in the world, even if those places had similar climates. And it got him thinking, like, why closely related species appear to exist on the near mainland continent, but not like in similar climatic areas elsewhere. And it led him to hypothesize that two identical populations can evolve separately from each other. So there is a relationship between organisms and their habitat. So habitat is the unit of space and its environmental features, principally the soil, the climate, the topography, water, available nutrition, and other organisms. And although different animals or organisms may occupy the same or very similar habitats, like different birds in a wetland, the interaction in the habitat is different for each species. The term niche is used to define an organism's way of life or what it does in its habitat. So insects that occupy like a tree canopy, for example, may survive by, eating leaves. They might, eat the nectar, or they might chew on bark. So each one has its own little niche. And because of the special relationship each organism has with its habitat, it's virtually impossible to trade one habitat for another. So unlike humans, who have a wide range of habitat versatility, most organisms displaced from one habitat cannot just simply take up life somewhere else. In addition, if a habitat is destroyed, they can't be recreated in a manner suitable to sustain most of the organisms that once were there. And this is especially true for complex habitats like tropical rainforests, where the niches are formed by many and often subtle interrelationships with the organisms, such as insects and microflora. So understanding how these things come together. So for example, there's a good example that I talk about in my physical geography class, and that is there are actually two different species of Joshua trees. Now, Joshua trees aren't trees, they're actually prehistoric lilies from the age of the dinosaur. And it's the way they reproduce. They have two ways of reproducing. either by cloning themselves, which is not adding to the genetic diversity. It's just like making a clone. You're just copying whatever problems you have to the next generation. So it's not a great way. But the other way that the Joshua trees reproduce is with a moth. So a moth gets in to the flower and does uses the flower to put its young in. So there's like 5 little bored holes inside the flower that comes off a Joshua tree. And what happens is if the beetle, I think it's a moth, sorry, it's not a beetle. So if the moth gets in there and he puts his young in all 5 of the holes, the Joshua tree is like, oh, well, this isn't viable. So it just drops it on the floor and nobody survives. So over time, what has happened is the moth has somehow determined or figured out it can only lay its eggs in no more than 3 of the 5 holes. And then it can survive. And then when it falls to the ground, the bug has something to eat and the seed comes out of the flower. But what they found is there are actually 2 different species that rely on 2 different moths in order to do this reproductive dance thing going on. And so, you know, each one has a different like habitat. All right. So increased demands for food and energy and economic development and space have increased the pressure to convert natural habitats into areas for population. So the area around Rancho Cucamonga used to be a lot of vineyards, hence the name vineyard. But over time, we've needed more space to put houses. And so we have, you know, converted those areas into houses. Already 30% of the Earth's land area, including Antarctica, is used for food production. And with the world population expected to reach about just under 10 billion by 2050, the area used for agriculture is expected to increase because we need more area for agriculture in order to have enough food for all the increase in population. And land use changes are among the greatest threats to the diversity of habitats and the organisms that make up these ecosystems. Now, conservation efforts are important, not only to protect biodiversity, but also to find natural solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and like planting more trees and protecting the soil and, you know, dealing with the forests that store carbon and things like that. This is showing you the number of species that are threatened or at risk due to habitat loss. So many countries started paying attention to the issues of species loss, and most developed and many developing countries have enacted guidelines that give certain organisms special status as protected species. Protected organisms that are receiving the most international attention or isolated species that are of particular importance to society. Often these species, such as the black rhinoceros or the African elephants, are taken or killed for economic purposes. The ivory tusks, the shark fin soup, you know, things like that. So in 1973, U.S. Congress passed something called the Endangered Species Act, and this law established 2 classes of protected species: threatened species. That means that it's threatened with extinction across all or a significant portion of its range. An endangered species is a species whose population is rapidly declining and may face extinction in the near future. It applies to all private, federal, state, and marine, so like out in the ocean environments, but focuses primarily on federal construction and land use projects like highways and flood channels and military bases and private projects that use federal funds or require federal permits to do. It also makes it illegal to kill or capture, purchase, possess, transport, sell, import, export endangered or endangered species. So the other class is threatened. So a threatened species is one that's threatened with extinction, and an endangered species is one whose population is already rapidly declining and may be extinct in the future. So it's like 2 levels. The importance of individual species conservation should not be underestimated, but it's not the central issue of species conservation. Central issue is the broader issue of biodiversity and habitat protection. Most species losses are caused by habitat destruction rather than exploitation of a particular individual organism. Therefore, we really need to focus on protecting the ecosystem as a whole, not just the animals or plants that, are kind of serve us, or we're like, oh, there's only 70 mating pairs left or something like that. So when protecting the ecosystem, habitats should really be taken into account because they're a really important part. And water features and, enforcing and enacting wetland laws and things like that are big steps that the Endangered Species Act and other acts that have followed have allowed us to do. So this is 6 different ways to deal with biodiversity loss. So creating conservation programs. They're very promising. They focus on open space, like parks and wildlife sanctuaries, land use programs where, limiting land use. For example, they're trying to do a land use program up in the high desert to protect the Joshua trees. Generating conservation and development projects. The Mojave Desert Land Trust is one of these. They purchase lands, or when you buy a piece of property and there's the species that is threatened, you can buy another piece of property to preserve and not build on. So a lot of times you get these conservation development projects. So you create a park or a reserve or something like that. Another one is repairing the landscape. So linking habitats and creating these corridors. One example is the idea that we don't have as many farms as we used to have. And so these small farms, which are no longer being used, or the fields are abandoned and things like that, creating a way for the animals to get from one patch of land to the next patch of land, rather than building them up with buildings and stuff like that. And then some of our richest and most diverse plant life are in watersheds. So that'd be streams, things like that. There are tons of dams and bridges. Just recently, I was reading in the LA Times, they're talking about potentially removing one of the dams on the Colorado because it's almost at what they call dead pool, which means that one of the reasons why we built dams is to generate electricity, but now there's not enough water behind the dam in order to spin the turbine, to generate the electricity anymore. So, and one of the issues is habitat fragmentation. So if you build a dam, the salmon, which swim upriver to wherever they were, born at, they go up the river. But if you put a dam there, then how do the salmon migrate back to their ancestral land? So, they created these fish ladders for them to do it, but restoring these scenic and areas like that recreationally, if we go out to Lake Paris and run our jet skis and our boats and all that stuff. So the total mass of like watershed problems in this country is like overwhelming. Mostly because there's just so many things that we've done. We've built dams, we've, put in bridges, we've created like flood control and irrigation projects, not to mention all of the pollution that drains into the oceans and the waters and things like that. So this week, I want to remind you, don't forget about the demographic transition model. It is due next week. I added some stuff to it because I got some feedback, like the first part of the activity, it was missing a chart. Oops, sorry. So hopefully you're working on that. This week's discussion deals with zoos. So many zoos. So the question is, are zoos and aquaria, which is like an aquarium, are they bad? And so kind of like, do zoos still have a place in our world? And so I want you to have like a true discussion. So a lot of people justify, keeping wild animals in captivity because it contributes to conservation, or education or research, or, we create these really cool parks like zoos or SeaWorld or something, and you can go recreate there. Breeding animals in captivity so they don't become extinct. So we're like, hey, there's only like 30 pairs of pandas, any giant pandas anymore. So if we put them in a zoo, then we can make sure that they don't have any problems having offspring and things like that. A lot of zoos work by, conserving wild animals or animals in the wild in their natural habitat. They also, like I said, they breed animals, which could potentially secure a population going into the future. So based on like your readings this week and this video here that you're watching, or the slides and your own experience, and I want you to do a little bit of research and talk about, like, what are your thoughts about these claims about whether zoos and aquaria are bad? And then I want you to talk about why or why not, and be sure to use your according tos and comment to 2 other people your thoughts on the subject. I've included a website that I found that might get you started. Oops. Oh, click on the website. It's this guy here from Tree Hugger. So it'll give you some arguments for and against zoos in case you need to spark your creative imagination. So again, it's linked here. So all right. So I have one last thing I want to share with you, and that's how wolves change rivers. So 2 terms that you need to be familiar with. Keystone species is a species in which other species in an ecosystem largely depend, such that if you take that species out, it would change what's going on in an environment very drastically. The other one is what we call a trophic cascade. So we talked about the trophic pyramid. The producers are at the bottom, the primary consumers. A trophic cascade is if you take the apex predator off, your tertiary or quaternary consumer, what happens to all of the stuff underneath? It causes what they call a trophic cascade. The whole thing just kind of breaks apart. So let's watch this video, and then I want you to think about that. Although we're not discussing it, but you can still watch the thing.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds, of migratory birds, started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
So again, this week was about biodiversity, conservation, and I talked about so I think that's it. I think that's all I have. That's it. That's all for now. So reading, take some time, really come up with an opinion as to whether or not you feel that we should have zoos or aquariums. You can pick a particular one that you want to talk about. There's a rubric in there, so you can see what I'm looking for in your discussion posts, and have a great week.